Harold Finch, 72, navigated the thawing Montana woods, eyes fixed on deer tracks, oblivious to the deadly snare hidden beneath the damp leaves. His boot hovered, ready to descend into the cold metal jaws. One more step, and he'd be trapped, alone, lost. Then a flash of red, a frantic yip. A blur of fur erupted from the underbrush, digging furiously at the very spot his foot was about to land, revealing the hidden wire just in time. Before I continue, drop a comment telling me where you're listening to this from. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. You won't want to miss the ending. Harold Finch, at 72, knew the Montana winter. He knew the bite of the wind off the Bitterroot Mountains, the way the snow could bury a man's tracks, and the silent, hungry desperation of the wild when food grew scarce. His small, isolated cabin was a bastion against it all, but even there, life was lean. Canned goods, dried meat, precious flour. Every last bit was accounted for, a careful balancing act to ensure he saw spring. It was mid-December when he first saw him. A flicker of movement in the snow-laden pines bordering his property, a patch of rusty red against the stark white. Not the vibrant, fiery coat of a healthy red fox, but a dull, matted shadow. Harold watched from his cabin window, sipping lukewarm coffee, his gaze sharp despite his years. The fox was young, maybe 3 years old, and clearly starving. Its movements were slow, jerky, as if each step was a battle. Detour. It pawed half-heartedly at the snow, snout close to the frozen ground, searching for anything. Its ribs showed beneath its sparse fur, a testament to the harsh season. A pang went through Harold. He'd seen plenty of starving creatures, understood the brutal calculus of nature, survival of the fittest. But something about this fox, its quick, nervous darting, even when so weak, stirred something in him. He knew what he had. He knew his own stores were barely enough. Still, he moved to the small larder, retrieved a piece of dried venison, tough and chewy, and a handful of dried berries. He stepped out onto the porch, the cold air hitting his face. The fox froze, its dull eyes fixed on him, a raw fear in their depths. Harold spoke softly, a low murmur against the wind. "Easy there, fella. Just some supper." He placed the meager offerings on a flat, frost-covered rock near the edge of his clearing. The fox, still hesitant, watched him retreat back into the cabin. Only when Harold was behind the glass again did the creature dart forward, snatching the meat and berries with surprising speed, then vanished into the deep snow as quickly as it had appeared. Harold watched the empty rock, a quiet satisfaction settling in his chest. He named him Flicker for that brief, nervous flash of movement. The winter deepened, and Harold continued his quiet vigil, leaving food on the rock every few days. Each piece of dried meat, every handful of flour used for a small baked biscuit meant less for him. He knew the cost, felt it in the dwindling supplies on his shelves. But Flicker kept coming, growing slightly bolder with each offering, a silent, wild acknowledgement of the man who shared what little he had. When Harold made his infrequent trip into town, nearly a month later, the cold was biting. The small general store in the valley was a hub of activity, a rare chance for him to stock up on essentials he couldn't trap or grow. He was buying a small bag of flour and some traps when he heard it, a low chuckle from the back of the store. "Still feeding the varmints, Harold?" Lloyd Holt, a rival trapper with a nasty glint in his eye, leaned against a barrel of nails. Bud Cobb, another local, stood beside him, nodding. "That's good meat you're wasting. Heard you practically got a pet fox out there." Harold turned, his face unreadable. "It's just a fox, Lloyd. Needs a meal," Lloyd scoffed, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the sawdust. "Needs a bullet is what it needs. Wild things ain't loyal, old man. Just hungry. Think you'll have that fox sitting at your table? You'll be eating bark by spring if you keep giving away your supplies to critters." Bud snickered. "Yeah, Harold, you're getting soft. Always were, I guess. That's a weakness out there." The words hung in the air, sharp and dismissive. Other townsfolk, picking through dry goods, pretended not to listen, but their sidelong glances confirmed what Harold already knew. They saw it as foolishness, a waste. He was throwing away precious resources, jeopardizing his own survival for an animal that wouldn't remember his kindness, an animal that would always be wild. He simply paid for his supplies, his jaw tight, ignoring their taunts. The walk back to his isolated cabin felt colder, the weight of their judgment heavier than the flour in his pack. He knew what they thought. He knew the risk he was taking. But deep down, he couldn't bring himself to stop. The image of Flicker, frail and desperate in the snow, was burned into his mind. He would keep feeding the fox, no matter what they said. The Montana winter tightened its grip. Day after day, the world outside Harold's cabin became a canvas of endless white and stark, silent pines. But Harold kept his promise to Flicker. Every few days, usually just after dawn, when the cold was at its most brutal, he'd step onto his porch. He'd place a few scraps, a bit of dried venison, a piece of fish he'd cured himself, sometimes even a few precious dried berries, onto the flat rock. He never lingered, never tried to get closer. He'd simply put the food down, speak a few soft words into the biting air, and retreat back inside. Flicker was a ghost at first, a flash of dull red fur, a nervous dart from the shadows of the pines, a quick grab, and then gone. Harold would watch from his cabin window, a quiet warmth spreading through him each time the fox successfully retrieved the food. The effort cost him, not just in dwindling supplies, but in the constant calculation of what he could spare. There were days he felt the gnawing doubt, the echo of Lloyd Holt's mocking words. "Wild things ain't loyal, old man." But then he'd remember the image of Flicker, emaciated and desperate, and the doubts would fade. As January bled into February, a subtle shift began. Flicker's movements, while still quick, became a little less frantic. He started waiting, just out of sight, sometimes only a few yards from the cabin, for Harold to put the food down. His scruffy fur, once matted and dull, began to regain its vibrant red luster, a testament to the nourishment. His thin frame started to fill out, his steps surer, more confident in the deep snow. Harold never pushed, never tried to close the distance. He simply watched, a silent understanding growing between the solitary man and the wild creature. It wasn't about taming, it was about shared survival, a wordless agreement in the heart of the wilderness. Then came the blizzard in late February, a true monster of a storm that howled down from the mountains with unprecedented fury. The cabin groaned under the wind, and snow piled up against the windows, threatening to bury them. Harold bundled up and ventured out, not for traps, but for Flicker. He put out a larger portion of dried meat, more than he usually would, knowing what this kind of weather meant for anything trying to live outside. He couldn't see Flicker anywhere. Hours later, as the storm raged, Harold was peering out his window, a worry tightening his chest. That's when he saw him. Huddled under the small overhang of the porch, barely a few feet from the cabin door, was Flicker. The fox was tucked into a tight ball, his nose buried in his tail, shivering visibly. He was exposed to the wind, but sheltered from the direct snowfall. Harold's heart went out to him. He slowly opened the door, just a crack, holding a piece of dried fish. Flicker's head shot up, eyes wide with alarm, but he didn't bolt. He watched Harold, a primal fear battling with the desperate need for shelter and food. Harold knelt, placing the fish just inside the edge of the overhang, not pushing it toward Flicker, just making it available. "You're safe here, little one," he murmured, his voice gentle against the roar of the wind. He retreated, leaving the door slightly ajar. After a long, tense moment, Flicker slowly unfurled himself, stretched his neck, and cautiously took the fish. He ate it there, under the protection of the porch, not darting off into the blinding snow. That was the moment, Harold knew, when the wary trust truly settled between them. A wild fox, choosing shelter beside a man, in the teeth of the harshest winter. As the fierce February blizzard finally retreated, leaving behind mountains of fresh snow, a new rhythm settled into Harold's solitary life. The act of leaving food for Flicker had become as natural as stoking his wood stove or checking his trap lines. Every few mornings, he'd brave the biting air, placing a small portion of dried meat or fish onto the familiar rock. He'd still speak in that same low, comforting murmur, a sound swallowed by the vast, silent wilderness. And Flicker, in turn, kept his quiet vigil. The fox's transformation was remarkable. By early March, Flicker's once dull, matted fur was a sight to behold. The brilliant red, almost flame-colored, seemed to shimmer against the melting snow, a stark contrast to the stark white landscape. He wasn't the gaunt shadow Harold first saw. He was sleek, muscled, a true marvel of the wilderness. His movements were no longer desperate and jerky, but fluid, confident, the embodiment of a healthy, cunning predator. His eyes, once clouded with fear and hunger, now held a bright, intelligent glint, missing nothing. The biggest change, though, wasn't just physical. It was in the way Flicker approached the cabin. He no longer bolted at Harold's first movement. Instead of vanishing into the deep shadows of the pines, he'd often linger, perhaps 20 feet from the cabin, his keen eyes fixed on Harold. Sometimes, he'd even sit down, tail curled neatly, just observing the old man as Harold went about his chores. He'd watch Harold split wood, mend a fence post, or clear snow from the path, a silent, unblinking presence. It was a wordless acknowledgement, a presence that offered a strange comfort in the vast solitude. One afternoon, Harold was out near the edge of his property, mending a section of fence damaged by heavy snow. He hadn't put food out that morning, knowing Flicker was strong enough to hunt for himself now. He looked up, wiping a gloved hand across his brow. And there Flicker was, not waiting by the rock, not darting for food, but sitting patiently on a low, snow-covered mound just beyond the fence line, his head cocked slightly, watching Harold work. He wasn't hiding, not even trying to be subtle. He was simply there. Harold paused, his hammer still, and offered a soft, almost imperceptible nod. Flicker didn't move, didn't run. He simply watched, a silent, wild companion in the late winter sun. It was a quiet moment, but it spoke volumes. It was as if the fox had chosen to be near, not out of hunger, but out of a different, unspoken connection. Harold rarely went to town anymore, as winter's end meant more work on the land, preparing for spring. But on one brisk trip in mid-March for a new axe head, he noticed Lloyd Holt and Bud Cobb were at the general store again, huddled near the pot-bellied stove. This time they didn't offer any barbed comments about wasted meat or getting soft. They just looked at Harold, then out at the burgeoning green of the woods, a silent, unreadable assessment on their faces. Their usual mocking smiles were absent. Harold felt a small, quiet satisfaction. Their mockery might have faded, or perhaps they were just tired of it. Either way, the silence was a welcome change. He bought his axe head, paid his dues, and headed back to the quiet of his cabin, the memory of Flicker's watchful presence a warm ember in his mind. The bond they'd forged, against all common sense, was real. And as the snows began their final, determined melt, That bond was about to be tested in a way Harold could never have imagined. Early April brought with it the kind of thaw that made the Bitterroot Mountains sing. The deep snows, which had held the land in a silent, frozen grip for months, were finally relenting. Roaring creeks, swollen with meltwater, tumbled down the mountainsides, their cheerful gurgle a welcome sound after the long, hushed winter. The air carried the damp, earthy scent of awakening soil, mingled with the sharp tang of pine needles. For Harold Finch, this was a time of renewal, but also of intense work. He was out on his trap lines, checking for any activity, ensuring everything was in order before the full burst of spring. He'd decided to venture a little further than usual that morning. Not far, but just beyond his usual boundaries, into a section of forest he knew was often disputed with Lloyd Holt. Lloyd was a rival trapper, known for his aggressive tactics and a nasty reputation for setting traps in questionable areas. Harold usually avoided the deeper parts of this disputed territory, preferring to keep to his own clear lines. But today, he'd spotted something that pulled him in. The fresh, unmistakable tracks of a particularly large buck, a trophy animal, heading deeper into the woods. A buck like that could provide enough meat to last him through the summer, a real prize after a lean winter. Harold's gaze was fixed on the damp forest floor, his weathered eyes scanning for any subtle sign. A broken twig, a disturbed patch of moss, the faint impression of a hoof. His mind was entirely deep in the hunt, meticulously piecing together the buck's path. He moved with the quiet grace of a man who had walked these woods for decades, every step deliberate, every sense alert to the nuances of the wilderness. The sun dappled through the still sparse canopy, painting shifting patterns on the ground. A gentle breeze whispered through the newly budding leaves, rustling the thick undergrowth. He rounded a dense thicket of pines, the needles still holding their winter green, creating a shadowed tunnel that opened into a small, relatively clear patch of ground. His boot, heavy with mud from the thawing earth, was poised to take the next step. Just ahead, partially hidden by damp leaves and loose soil, was a glint. A thin, almost invisible wire loop, an illegal leg-hold snare designed for something large, something heavy. It was placed precisely where Harold's next step would land, cunningly camouflaged by a scattering of leaves and a few broken twigs. He didn't see it. His focus was entirely on a faint scuff mark just beyond the snare, a fresh sign of the buck's passage. He was unsuspecting, his mind already calculating the next move in his pursuit. The snare was silent, a deadly, patient hunter lying in wait. It was utterly invisible to his distracted gaze, a cruel treachery hidden in the natural beauty of the forest. And since you've made it this far, go ahead and hit that like button. It really helps me keep bringing stories like this. His boot began its slow descent, just one step away from disaster, from the cold, steel jaws that would snap shut with bone-crushing force. He was alone, miles from his cabin, with no one to know where he was, or that he was in danger. The snare waited. Harold's boot, heavy with damp earth, descended into the patch of rustling leaves. He was focused entirely on the faint scuff mark ahead, a whisper of the buck's passage. He didn't feel the thin wire loop until it was too late. There was a sudden, sickening thwack of metal, a violent bone-jarring impact that ripped through his worn leather boot and shot a searing bolt of agony up his leg. He cried out, a raw, involuntary sound, as the world spun. His old frame crumpled, hitting the cold, damp forest floor with a breathless grunt. His breath hitched, a gasp trapped in his throat. He lay there, stunned, the pain a white-hot spear in his shin, a vice clamped around his lower leg. He struggled to push himself up, hands scrambling against the slick, thawing earth. His eyes, watering from the shock, finally focused on the trap. It was a cruel thing. A powerful steel jaw designed to hold something much larger than a man, its teeth biting deep into the thick leather of his boot and unmistakably into his flesh. It was an illegal snare, the kind Lloyd Holt was known for, set by someone who didn't care about the suffering it would cause. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at him. He tried to pull his leg free, grunting with effort, but the trap held fast, unyielding. He reached down, his fingers fumbling, trying to find the release, but the mechanism was hidden, buried in the mud and leaves, and the pain intensified with every frantic tug. The cold began to seep into his clothes, the dampness of the forest floor chilling him to the bone. He pulled again, twisting, a whimper escaping his lips, but the trap only dug in deeper. He could feel the warmth of blood blooming inside his boot, a grim, spreading dampness. He was alone, miles from his cabin. No one knew where he was or when he'd be back. The sun was already dipping below the treetops, casting long, purple shadows across the forest. The air grew colder, thick with the damp scent of thawing earth and distant pine. He pressed his face against the muddy ground, trying to catch his breath, the exhaustion suddenly overwhelming him. He lay there, shivering, the pain a constant, throbbing reminder of his predicament. He spent what felt like an eternity, gritting his teeth, wrestling with the cold, unfeeling steel. He found the release bar, but it was stiff, rusted, refusing to budge with his weakening grip. His fingers were numb, clumsy. Each attempt sent fresh waves of agony through his leg, until finally he fell back, defeated. The strength simply wasn't there anymore. He was an old man, and this trap was stronger. A grim acceptance began to settle over him, heavy and cold as the evening air. He looked up at the darkening canopy, the branches weaving a silent, indifferent pattern against the bruised sky. He might not get out of this. He might spend the night here, caught, alone, vulnerable. A profound sense of isolation washed over him, deeper than any he'd ever felt in his solitary life. His mind, weary and blurred by pain, drifted. He thought of Flicker, not as a hope, not as a solution, but as a quiet, stubborn warmth in his chest. He remembered the flash of red fur against the snow, the nervous dart for food, the gradual softening of wildness. He thought of the blizzard night, Flicker huddled under his porch, accepting shelter. A strange, unexpected gratitude filled him for that impossible bond, for the quiet companionship the fox had offered during the long, lonely winter. It had been a small act of kindness, given without expectation, and it had brought something gentle into his harsh existence. He closed his eyes, leaning his head against a moss-covered root, trying to conserve what little warmth he had left. The forest was growing silent, settling into the long night. Then, from somewhere across the field, a sharp, insistent sound cut through the stillness. A yip, not a distant howl, but closer, clearer, a high-pitched cry that seemed to carry an urgent message on the chilled air. Harold's boot continued its slow, deliberate descent. His eyes were still fixed on the faint scuff mark ahead, a subtle crease in the damp leaves, evidence of the buck he was tracking. The air hung heavy with the scent of pine and thawing earth. He was so utterly focused on the hunt, so lost in the intricate puzzle of the forest floor, that the world around him seemed to narrow to that one spot, that one vital clue. His weight was shifting, his balance already committing to the next stride, his old body moving with the practiced ease of countless years spent in these woods. He was just an inch, a breath, from placing his foot squarely onto the hidden danger. Then everything shattered. A blur of fiery red fur erupted from the underbrush to his right, a streak of pure energy against the muted greens and browns of the forest. It wasn't a cautious movement, not the furtive dart of a creature trying to avoid detection. This was a sudden, urgent explosion of motion, an intensity Harold had never witnessed in Flicker, not even when the fox was snatching food in the depths of winter. The fox didn't flee from Harold. Instead, he shot directly in front of the old man, planting himself with surprising force right at the spot where Harold's heavy boot was about to land. A sharp, piercing yip ripped through the quiet forest, a sound of alarm, clear and unmistakable. It was followed instantly by a low, insistent growl, a sound that held a desperate, frantic urgency. Flicker's head was down, his powerful front paws already digging furiously at the very patch of damp leaves and loose soil where Harold's boot was destined to meet the ground. Leaves and dark earth flew, scattering in a frantic shower. The suddenness of Flicker's actions, the sheer force and desperation in his movements, instantly ripped Harold's attention away from the buck tracks. His head snapped down, his eyes widening in confusion, then in an ice-cold wave of understanding. The fox was not digging for a buried morsel. He was digging to reveal something. As the last of the damp leaves flew, the glint of thin wire, the cold, unforgiving steel of an illegal leg-hold snare, lay fully exposed beneath. It was there, stark and deadly, mere inches from the toe of Harold's descending boot. Time seemed to stretch, thin and fragile. Harold froze, his boot suspended in the air, barely a finger's width from the trigger plate. A cold dread, sharper than any winter wind, washed over him, seizing his chest. He saw it all then, the cruel jaws, the powerful spring mechanism, the brutal effectiveness of it. He pictured the pain, the isolation, the slow, agonizing wait for help that might never come. It was Lloyd Holt's work, unmistakably so, laid with a malice that chilled Harold to his core. Flicker, having revealed the deadly trap, backed away slightly, his frantic digging ceasing. He stood a few feet off, his bright, intelligent eyes fixed on Harold. There was no wild flight, no retreat into the shadows. Instead, he watched, his gaze unwavering, as if confirming the threat, as if waiting for Harold to finally grasp the danger he had averted. His fiery red fur seemed to shimmer, a beacon of warning in the quiet, treacherous woods. In that moment, Harold knew, with a certainty that reached deeper than words, that the fox had remembered every kindness, every shared morsel, and had now, against all the instincts of the wild, returned the favor in the most profound way imaginable. His heart hammered, not from fear alone, but from a profound, overwhelming gratitude. Harold's breath hitched, a ragged sound in the sudden silence of the woods. His boot, still hovering, now felt impossibly heavy. He slowly, carefully, pulled his foot back, away from the lethal steel jaws, as if moving in slow motion. The cold dread that had gripped him intensified as he finally put both feet firmly on the solid ground, nowhere near the trap. His knees trembled, threatening to give out beneath him. He didn't collapse, but he had to lean heavily against the rough bark of a pine tree, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. His hand flew to his chest, trying to calm the frantic beat. Flicker, still a few feet away, watched him. His eyes, bright and unwavering, seemed to bore into Harold, a silent, profound understanding passing between man and beast. Harold swallowed hard, his throat dry. You saved me, little one," he croaked, the words barely a whisper. His voice was hoarse with shock and a gratitude so immense it felt like a physical ache. He looked from Flicker to the glinting trap, a cruel, cold object now fully exposed, then back to the fox, who remained perfectly still, a silent guardian. The sheer audacity of it, a wild creature intervening to save a man, defied every scrap of common sense, every cynical word Lloyd Holt and Bud Cobb had ever uttered. Wild things ain't loyal, just hungry. The memory of their sneers was a stark contrast to Flicker's brave, frantic warning. Harold's hand, still shaking, reached for a long, sturdy branch lying nearby, fallen from an old oak. He took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to steady himself. This trap, illegal and malicious, needed to be dealt with. With utmost care, his movements stiff and deliberate, Harold used the branch to poke at the snare. The steel gleamed, a menacing promise of pain. He nudged the trigger plate, then worked at the release mechanism, the rusty metal groaning as he struggled. It took several attempts, his hand still trembling from the adrenaline and shock, but finally, with a sharp clank, the jaws sprang open, rendered harmless. He then carefully bent the wire, dismantling the trap entirely, rendering it useless. The weight of the metal felt heavy and cold in his gloved hands as he tucked the crumpled pieces into his pack, a grim trophy of a near disaster. He took another moment, leaning against the pine, just breathing, letting the quiet of the woods slowly soothe the ragged edges of his fear. The air, though crisp, felt warmer now, infused with a strange new hope. He looked at Flicker again. The fox had not moved, still observing him with that steady, intelligent gaze. It was as if he understood the gravity of the moment, the enormity of what had almost happened. Harold pushed himself away from the tree, his leg still a little wobbly, but holding. He started the long walk back toward his cabin. It wasn't across an open field to a farmhouse, but deeper into the silent, familiar woods, towards the distant, comforting presence of his small, solitary home. He walked slowly, his pace measured, his mind replaying the flash of red fur, the frantic digging, the sharp, urgent yips. Each step was a quiet victory against what might have been. Flicker didn't disappear into the underbrush immediately. Instead, he began to trot silently beside Harold, keeping pace with the old man's slow, deliberate steps. He was close, closer than he had ever been in the open woods, sometimes just a few feet away, his movements fluid and graceful. Harold glanced down at him occasionally, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The fox would meet his gaze for a brief moment, his dark eyes reflecting the dappled light, before looking straight ahead again, as if guiding him, ensuring he stayed safe. They walked like this for a long time, the only sounds the crunch of Harold's boots on the damp earth and the rustle of the wind through the pines. For nearly a mile, Flicker remained a steadfast, silent companion, a vibrant dash of red against the browns and greens of the awakening forest. The shock of the near-fatal encounter began to recede, replaced by a deep, profound sense of wonder and a quiet, unshakable gratitude. He wasn't leaning on Flicker for physical support, but the fox's presence was a comfort, a silent anchor in the emotional storm that had just passed. It was a journey of recovery, not just from physical danger, but from the stark, cold indifference the wilderness sometimes held. Then, as they reached the familiar boundary of Harold's property, where the woods began to thin out toward his clearing, Flicker finally veered off. He didn't stop, didn't say goodbye. He simply turned, a fluid motion, and melted back into the deeper woods, his fiery tail giving one soft, final wag before he was gone. Harold watched the spot where he vanished, a lump in his throat. The woods felt different now, not just a place of survival, but a place where kindness could transcend the boundaries of species, and where a silent debt could be repaid in the most extraordinary way. He was home, and he was safe, thanks to a fox named Flicker. Harold pushed himself away from the tree, his legs still a little wobbly, but holding. He started the long walk back toward his cabin. It wasn't across an open field to a farmhouse, but deeper into the silent, familiar woods, towards the distant, comforting presence of his small, solitary home. He walked slowly, his pace measured, his mind replaying the flash of red fur, the frantic digging, the sharp, urgent yips. Each step was a quiet victory against what might have been. Flicker didn't disappear into the underbrush immediately. Instead, he began to trot silently beside Harold, keeping pace with the old man's slow, deliberate steps. He was close, closer than he had ever been in the open woods, sometimes just a few feet away, his movements fluid and graceful. Harold glanced down at him occasionally, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The fox would meet his gaze for a brief moment, his dark eyes reflecting the dappled light, before looking straight ahead again, as if guiding him, ensuring he stayed safe. They walked like this for a long time, the only sounds the crunch of Harold's boots on the damp earth and the rustle of the wind through the pines. For nearly a mile, Flicker remained a steadfast, silent companion, a vibrant dash of red against the browns and greens of the awakening forest. The shock of the near-fatal encounter began to recede, replaced by a deep, profound sense of wonder and a quiet, unshakable gratitude. He wasn't leaning on Flicker for physical support, but the fox's presence was a comfort, a silent anchor in the emotional storm that had just passed. It was a journey of recovery, not just from physical danger, but from the stark, cold indifference the wilderness sometimes held. Then, as they reached the familiar boundary of Harold's property, where the woods began to thin out toward his clearing, Flicker finally veered off. He didn't stop, didn't say goodbye. He simply turned, a fluid motion, and melted back into the deeper woods, his fiery tail giving one soft, final wag before he was gone. Harold watched the spot where he vanished, a lump in his throat. The woods felt different now, not just a place of survival, but a place where kindness could transcend the boundaries of species, and where a silent debt could be repaid in the most extraordinary way. He was home, and he was safe, thanks to a fox named Flicker. Harold returned home later that day, the grim, dismantled snare now a chilling weight in his pack. He carefully placed it in his shed, a constant reminder of the day he almost lost everything, and the unlikely hero who saved him. The memory of Flicker's urgent warning, the frantic digging, was burned into his mind. He spent the evening by his fire, a quiet man filled with a profound sense of grace and connection to the wild. The next morning, Harold headed into town for a few supplies. The need for flour was real, but there was also something else, an unspoken pull to re-enter the world after such a private, momentous event. As he approached the small general store, he saw them. Bud Cobb, leaning against the wooden porch rail, chewing on a piece of straw, and beside him, Lloyd Holt, the rival trapper, known for his harsh ways and, Harold suspected, the very man who set that cruel snare. Other trappers and locals milled about, sharing the morning's gossip. Their usual chatter died down as Harold approached. They looked at his quiet, reflective face, then out at the dark line of the forest that stretched beyond the edge of town. No words were exchanged about the fox this time, no mocking comments about wasted meat or getting soft. The usual jests were absent, replaced by a profound, uncomfortable silence. Lloyd Holt's eyes, usually so sharp and dismissive, held a flicker of something unreadable as he watched Harold. Bud Cobb shifted his weight, his gaze distant. Harold's solemn demeanor, the faint, knowing look in his eyes, seemed to carry a profound story that needed no words. He carried himself differently, not with arrogance, but with a quiet strength that emanated from a deeper truth. They didn't mock his kindness. A quiet, dawning respect seemed to settle over their faces, a grudging understanding that Harold Finch now carried a truth about the wild that they couldn't quite grasp. It was the truth of a silent debt repaid in the deep heart of the woods, a testament to a kindness that had defied all reason and, ultimately, saved a life. The wilderness had shown them a loyalty they had stubbornly denied, and Harold, the old trapper, stood as its humble, knowing witness. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. Your support is what brings these stories to more people.